everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Building Your Wealth Bridge. A little bit of a different format today. I'll be doing this episode solo. Part of the reason why I'm doing it alone was this episode's really going to be built off of a few different client cases I've had on Social Security over the last year. 3 different clients, 3 different analyses around Social Security, and really gave me perspective on 3 different ways to look at, why you might want to file early or in the middle, or as late as you can when you're thinking about Social Security. And Social Security has been an interesting topic as I've got around 8 to 10 years in this business. We run this analysis for clients as part of their retirement plan, but it's an interesting topic to review with clients because, number one, I've learned it's important to get to clients before they even reach their filing age, because there's quite a range of ages where people could file. And so, even as an advisor, my initial thought was maybe most people were going to wait until their full retirement age to start collecting. But as an advisor, that can be dangerous because there's just some people that have strong opinions about I'm going to file as early as possible. And so we've kind of rebuilt our process to say and reach out to people at around 60, 61 to engage them and say, let's take a look at what your filing options look like before you even reach early retirement filing age. But what's interesting is, if they decide at 62 or we reach out to them at 61, I'm just going to wait until 70. That's another 8 years until they actually file. And what I've also seen is that things can change between 62 and 70. I think one example might be there was this repeal of people that were having their benefit amounts affected by pensions that they were getting as a part of being an employee at a government entity. And people may have been making the decision to wait until 70 to file, partially because their benefit amount was being affected by their government pension. When that rule got repealed, all of a sudden people are getting a lot higher benefit amount. And so it may make sense in the middle, of that initial decision at 62 to say, hey, I'm going to wait till 70. If that rule change happened at 66, they might completely change their perspective on how they're going to file based upon, a law change that occurs around Social Security. So I think it's an interesting topic, number one, because that age range, is pretty wide, I think, in terms of when people are going to decide to file for Social Security. And I would say for viewers that are listening to this on Spotify, I put together a PowerPoint. You may want to watch this on YouTube. Just going to go through some of these slides here. I'm not going to do presentation mode just so I can flip between these slides. But another interesting thing that was kind of an eye-opener to me when I joined the industry is that people have really strong opinions about Social Security, more so than the age they think they're going to retire, more so than what they think their Medicare strategy is, or whether or not they need any sort of form of insurance. Clients that I've talked to over the years seem to fall into a couple of different categories, and they feel really strongly about how they should file when it comes to Social Security. So I've got 3 client types here that I've seen over the years, and that first client type, and again, none of these are wrong approaches, but people just have strong opinions about them. The first type of client is the person that says, I'm going to file as early as possible. They felt, I paid my dues into the system. They don't fully trust that the benefits are always going to be there. We've seen in the news, if the government doesn't take any action, I think it's by, it used to be 2035, but now it might be 2032, that benefits are going to be reduced by 25%. For anybody that is collecting them. And so some people say, I'm going to get as much as I can now, even though by filing at 62, I'm going to get a much smaller benefit than if I would wait until my full retirement age. People in this category also feel really strongly, and I've noticed particularly with men, they feel like, my dad passed away at 65, a heart attack, he was going to collect, at 67 for Social Security, and he didn't, get a penny. Maybe his widow got something, but that's not going to happen to me. I'm going to collect at 62, and if I don't live long, I'll have at least collected something along the way. And so there's kind of a mortality issue there where people are just convinced that they're not going to live to 95 or 100. The second type of client And I would say of the three, this is the least common, in terms of strong opinions. But some people will say, hey, I'm definitely going to wait till my full retirement age, which for most people at this point is pretty much 67. And really the main opinion I've seen people have in this regard is I've paid into the system. I know if I file early at 62, I'm going to get a very reduced benefit. I want to get at least what I put into the system and what they promised to pay me if I wait until 67. And so I'm going to wait till full retirement age. I'm not going to wait until 70. But I'm going to wait until they're going to give me 100% of my benefit, and then I'm going to file for Social Security. So that's client type 2. And then the third type of client is the people that feel really strongly about waiting until 70. And the biggest thing that they like about that approach is, hey, every year that I wait after my full retirement age, if that's 67 for someone, they're going to get an 8% bump in their benefit amount. And so from a numbers perspective, they feel like, hey, I think, I've got longevity in my family. I'm going to live long. I think I can beat the system by, waiting a little bit longer, getting a guaranteed increase. And then after I hit 70, if I lived to 90, I'll have collected so much more than if I had collected at 62 and lived to 90. So that's another interesting aspect I've seen with Social Security is people have these really strong opinions about it. But I think what's really interesting about what goes along with people having these super strong opinions is that this filing for Social Security is much more of an art than a science. And really, there is no perfect way to approach this. And the biggest reason is nobody knows how long they're going to live. So for that first client type that says, I'm going to file as early as I can, if they end up living to 100, they would have collected a lot more if they would have waited until 70, assuming the government doesn't cut the benefits in future years. But it's the same thing for people that say, hey, I'm going to get that 8% increase every year after I wait for my full retirement age. And when I file at 70, I'm going to get a huge benefit amount. If they die a year later, that will have been a mistake. And so there's no perfect scientific answer to when you should file. People will ask me, we run a lot of analyses where they say, well, where's the break even point if I file at 62 versus 67 or 70? And usually there's this range of, somewhere between 78 and 82 if you live till at least that age. That's where you'll find that break even point. And so basically what that means is if you die at any point before you turn 78, many times, not always, but many times we run these analyses, people that file at 62, will have collected more by filing early. And then for people that live beyond 82, they'll have collected more if they waited until 70 to file. And so even though, no decision's bulletproof, nobody knows how long they're going to live, there have been times, early on in my career where I just thought, well, is it worth doing a really thorough analysis, putting a lot of thought into it if you just don't know how long you're going to live? And I don't think you just throw your hands up and say, it's not even worth looking at because I don't know how long I'm going to live. I do think, there's markers you can look at when it comes to your individual scenario. And there's three, like I said, there's three client cases that I ran into where I think, we discussed what we think is the best path, but what we thought might even be some alternative paths that would get people, to probably the closest, to optimizing their situation that they could from a Social Security standpoint. And so I always think an analysis is worthwhile, even if it confirms what you already know. And so just a couple of quick terms for those that aren't familiar with Social Security at all, and just things that we'll be referencing throughout these three client cases. The first is, I mentioned full retirement age. That's basically the age, at which you're eligible to receive 100% of your Social Security benefits. For most people, it's going to be 67, as I said. Over the years, it used to be 65, then 66, and, for some people, 66 in 3 months. But we're getting to the point where pretty much everybody at this point, their full retirement age will be 67. Another term that we'll mention is the primary insurance amount. And so when you hit 67, you'll see on your Social Security statement, they'll list, hey, your PIA, your primary insurance amount, might be $3,000. That's the dollar amount that you'll collect if you wait until 67. And so that's just kind of a, another term that they'll use when they're talking about your full retirement age and specifically the amount that you're going to collect. And then the third term, and this is kind of a very unique provision that can come in play, but I want to mention it because, it came into play for, two of the client cases that we'll talk about is what's called the widow's limit provision, okay? And the gist of it is, basically the government wants to ensure that if somebody files early and they pass away and their widow or widower is going to be dependent on their Social Security, to live on during the rest of their retirement, they want to ensure that they're getting at least a minimum amount of what they think is appropriate. And so there are cases essentially where somebody files at 62, they're getting a benefit amount where a widow can actually get a higher amount than that person was collecting after they pass. So those are just a couple of terms to be aware of as we go through these client cases. So as I mentioned, 3 different client cases. One, we'll discuss, the case for filing early. The second one has to do with what I call, a mixed strategy where, we recommended, one filing age for a spouse that was a little bit earlier on. And we recommended for the other spouse, maybe waiting later to start collecting on their Social Security. And then the final case study had to do with an individual where for both him and his wife, we discussed it. We thought it might be prudent to wait until 70 for them both to file. And so these are real life case studies. We've changed the names for privacy, but the reason why I think as advisors we get excited when we've got these real life cases that we can bring and produce content with is, sometimes I feel like when we don't have real cases and they're hypothetical cases, we'll start with the numbers and we'll kind of wrap a story around that. But it really legitimizes to me when I run into these real life cases where people kind of come to me with their story and their scenario, and then we kind of wrap the numbers around their circumstances, that it just legitimizes that there is good planning to be done when it comes to something like Social Security. And it brings, to my mind that, even for someone like me that only works with 150, 175 clients, you may look at 1 or 2 of these cases and say, well, that's a very unique type of scenario. There's a lot of people that are filing for Social Security year in and year out. And so I think, even some of these maybe more unique seeming cases apply to more people than you think. And my thought is, hey, even if I work with 150, 175 people and I can find 3 different cases just among that pool of people, it's probably affecting more people than I would have initially thought. And so starting with the first case study, this is Charlie and Emily. All right, they're near retirees. They're actually retired now, but I was working with them a couple years ago. They were getting ready to retire. Charlie's 61 and Emily is 59. They're both retired. Total net worth, they've got around 1.25 million in assets. Around $750,000 is invested in assets with our firm. It's mostly, qualified money in IRAs and then some Roth IRAs. And Charlie worked in construction for his entire career, and then Emily was a teacher. It's relevant because they're both receiving pensions. What's interesting about them both receiving pensions, and particularly for Emily, I think she worked in at a school district where her Social Security benefit was going to be affected by the fact that she was collecting her pension. And I'll explain, how that changed here in a second when it came to their analysis. But we took a look at, for Charlie and Emily, what they would collect if they both waited until 67. And so Charlie's benefit amount was a little under $3,900 a month if you waited until 67, and then Emily's amount was a little under $2,900 a month. And I think why that was important was this wasn't a scenario where Charlie's benefit amount was much larger than Emily's, and Emily was going to depend on the spousal benefit or file for the spousal benefit. Their benefit amounts were relatively close, I would say, because they were both working, over 30 to 40 years. And so that was kind of one thing that was a little bit unique to them. And then in terms of how they were approaching it, I remember when we started talking about Social Security and their portfolio with us, um, their thought, like a lot of people, was, right now, we've got our pensions, but then everything else we're kind of relying on the portfolio. And as we know with markets, nothing is guaranteed. And so, there was this thought of, hey, it would feel good to them to have another supplemental income stream get started, one that was guaranteed, and take a little bit of pressure off of the investment portfolio. But they weren't in a spot with their living expenses where they absolutely needed Social Security as early as possible. And so what we had talked about and what they had told me was, hey, we could wait till 67. We could make it work. What was likely was that, they might have a withdrawal rate on their portfolio of, maybe 5 to 7%. And so, their thought was, hey, should we continue to withdraw from the portfolio and use our pensions and, hopefully still continue to see the invested assets grow. But if we go through a tough market stretch, is it worth waiting till later on to collect Social Security at the risk of maybe seeing our portfolio shrink because we're taking withdrawals, from the portfolio? And so, a couple things that Charlie was asking me specifically was, first of all, talking about should I wait until full retirement age at 67 to get that full amount of 3,900, or should I, file early at 62? And he knew that there was going to be a very reduced benefit amount that he was going to get. It would go from like 3,900 to almost 2,750 a month. And, that's what he was grappling with was, is it worth it? That's 5 more years that he could be collecting a Social Security benefit. But at the cost of $1,100 a month, that's not a small chunk of change. And so that was question number one, was should he wait or should he think about filing early? His biggest concern was really about Emily and how Emily's benefit was going to be affected. And he was curious, if I file early, how is that going to affect her filing strategy and her potential benefit? And mainly what he was looking for was, is there any negatives to her benefit from what I do, essentially? And so that was another question he had. And I think the final thing was thinking about, okay, depending on what I do, Charlie's like, I've got the higher benefit amount. Something happens to me, I pass before Emily does. How does that affect her survivor benefits? And so those were the main things that he was looking at. And, I had a couple of thoughts after started to review things. And at the first, I think the most important one, because he was very concerned about Emily's benefit, was looking at what his benefit was versus what her benefit was at full retirement age. And like I said, they were they were close enough to where no matter how long Charlie waited to collect his benefit, Emily was never going to file for the spousal benefit. She was basically going to file for her own benefit at some point, and that was always going to be higher than if Charlie, delayed. He started collecting his own benefit, and then Emily wanted to get spousal benefit. And so I think that was really important to know up front, because it told Charlie that, hey, you waiting might be good for you, but it's not good for Emily. So that's important for you to know up front. The second thing that was interesting, I mentioned, Charlie was in construction, Emily was teacher, was a couple of years ago. I think at least Emily's benefit was going to be affected by some of the provisions that were in place in terms of, government pensions offsetting some of her Social Security amount. And so when that was repealed, it changed the numbers in terms of how much Emily was going to be able to collect. And so I think that was key to know, was that, had they looked at this just a year or two ago, they might have made a decision based on outdated information. And so it can be critical, now that that provision has changed, for people to take a fresh look if they're thinking about their filing strategy. And I think the third thing, and this was, a bit of a unique provision that even I had, not too much awareness of, was thinking about Emily's survivor benefit. Okay. And basically, to answer Charlie's last question of, if I file early at 62, how is that going to affect, Emily's survivor benefit? And the answer there is that it was going to be affected. So Charlie would collect less during his lifetime, which meant that, Emily potentially would collect less through her survivor benefit. But after digging into it, that reduction would be not as much, as maybe she initially thought because of what's called this widow's limit provision. And we'll kind of go into how that came into play when we thought about uh, them filing early. And so, you know, what we ended up thinking about at the end of the day, and I would say health wise, in relatively good health. I think, maybe they were both former smokers. So that was something to be taken into account. Relatively average, I think, longevity in the family. And so that's not something that weighed heavily on the decision. But, you know, what really drove this recommendation for them to file early to me was the existence of this widow's limit provision. Okay. And so what I thought might be a good idea was because Emily was going to get no benefit in the form of a spousal benefit by Charlie delaying his benefit, and they could use the income. I thought it was interesting to explore, Charlie filing early at 62, and basically he would get around 2750 a month. They're very close in age, so basically Emily would kind of fall in right behind him, and when she hit 62, she could start collecting her own benefit, and she would get around $2,000 a month. And so, the main thing that we were looking at was, what happens if Charlie dies? And if he died early on, at 62 or 63, Emily would still be collecting her own benefit. She'd be missing out on the 2750 that Charlie was getting, but she'd still have some income coming in because she filed early as well. But at some point, she could file for her survivor benefit. And basically, she would want to wait until she can get 100% of her survivor benefit. And that's based upon something called the widow's benefit matrix, which is really, it's just on a case by case basis. So that's a different age for everybody. But what the key factor here for me in this scenario was, in most circumstances, when someone files for a survivor benefit, they basically get what their spouse was collecting. So at first glance, you would think, okay, Emily was collecting around $2,000 a month. Charlie was getting around 2750. When she files for her survivor benefit, she's going to get 2750. But I'd mentioned the government has this widow's limit provision, which essentially states that they want to make sure that Emily is getting at least a minimum amount that they think will help sustain her living expenses. And so essentially what she would qualify for instead of that 2750 is 82.5% of Charlie's primary insurance amount, which again, that primary insurance amount is the amount that Charlie would get if he waited until his full retirement age. Okay. That amount is around $3,200 versus 2,750, which is basically like an extra $500 a month. And so, once I had heard about that and looked at the numbers of what it might look like for the two of them, I compared that 3,200 to what Charlie would be collecting when he turned, I think it was 65 or 66. And if Charlie waited until 65 or 66, he would get around that same amount. It would be around like $3,200, $3,300. And so the way that I looked at it was Charlie can basically file at 62. Okay. He gets 3 extra years of collecting his benefit. Okay. And assuming something happens to him, Emily would get the same amount in a survivor benefit that she would have gotten had he waited until 65 or 66 to file. And so, this is not something that's saying this is definitely the only answer. It's totally dependent on how long they live. But I thought it was kind of somewhat of a convincing argument to me when I looked at it to say, if they both file early, they'll get this income stream to start coming, and it's reduced benefits, but it takes a lot of pressure off of their portfolio. And their benefit amounts are close enough to where there's no sense in Charlie waiting just so Emily can get the spousal benefit. And, if Charlie does pass away, he's the higher income earner from a Social Security standpoint. Emily's going to get an increased benefit, not only from her benefit to what Charlie was collecting, but even an enhanced benefit through the widow's limit provision. And so I think that was just something that was very interesting to me. It was kind of a nuanced case where I'd never heard of this widow's limit provision. And it really surprised me because when I initially sat down with them, I thought, I've never really had a case where I thought, it makes a lot of sense to file as early as possible. But that was a bit eye-opening to me. So second case study came up shortly after that, and this is Alex and Carrie. Again, they're both retired. Alex is 63 and Carrie is 61. Okay. What was interesting about this case, or I should say different from Charlie and Emily, is that even though Carrie's younger, she has a much higher primary insurance amount than Alex, or I shouldn't say much higher, but it's about $1,000 higher a month. And so Alex is older than Carrie is, but his benefit amount is going to be smaller when he files. So their net worth, they had a sizable net worth. It's around $5 million in total. Okay. And if around 4 million of it's invested, and then they've got a couple of homes that are worth around $1 million each. But what was unique about their case, on the face of it, you think, hey, you've got $5 million, you should be fine whether you file at 62 or 70. But what was unique about their case is they had around $2 million, around 40% of their overall net worth in a single stock that the husband owned, and he had owned for years and years and years. And so his concern was, they're retired, they're still relatively young, they're not collecting Social Security yet. And every time he needs money, he's relying on his portfolio, and he's been kind of chipping away at this concentrated stock that he has. But every time he sells a piece of it, he triggers a big gain. He's got very low basis in the stock, so he's triggering taxes. And he feels very dependent on this stock, meaning that if that stock were to crater and lose 50% of its value, all of a sudden their total net worth goes from 5 million to 4 million. So he felt like he was very dependent on the stock, more so than he would have liked. And lifestyle wise, they didn't live overly extravagant lifestyle. They had 2 homes. But they do live a good lifestyle. They like to travel a lot. They give to their children. They're not planning on selling either of their homes. They really want to hold on to them, so their expenses are a little bit higher for the maintenance and upkeep on those. And so the main concerns, I mentioned the first one was Alex is concerned that if that stock craters, he's going to go from being super confident in retirement to all of a sudden questioning, hey, can we afford this? Again, similar to Charlie and Emily, they felt like they were completely reliant on the portfolio. And they thought that turning on a guaranteed income stream like Social Security might take some of the pressure off of the portfolio and just allow them to lower their withdrawal rate, where they can keep more of their funds invested, create a little less of a tax problem by not having to sell, the single concentrated stock at a huge gain each year. And basically, be able to invest a little more for the long term than constantly going back to the portfolio to sell and raise cash. They also have an accountant. I mentioned people have very strong opinions. As the advisor, they came to me, but they also talked to their accountant, who was a friend, and he was one of those people with very strong opinions about you definitely should be filing as early as possible, no questions asked. So we took a look at his situation, and a couple of thoughts that I had come up with was, Alex, because he had the lower benefit amount and because he was older, again, it didn't make a bunch of sense for him to wait until his wife filed because he wasn't going to collect a spousal benefit. Basically, he was always going to collect his benefit amount, no matter how long she waited. Thing was also because he's older. One thing that widows, if Carrie survives Alex, that's important for them to know is you don't have to switch to, your survivor benefits right away. Or if she hasn't filed for her personal benefit, she can file for survivor benefits and continue to delay her own personal benefit. And I think there's a bit of a nuance there where people think, well, if I'm already collecting my benefit, well, she's got the higher amount, so she, would continue to collect her benefit amount. But if she hasn't started collecting her benefit amount, she can, as I said, delay that. So those were just a couple things that I thought were a little bit nuanced in their situation. So what we ended up coming up with In their case, again, it was a little bit mixed in that we suggested that, maybe Alex think about filing now at 63. Again, it's going to be a reduced benefit amount. He's only going to get around, 1840 a month. But it starts to help with that concern of being completely reliant on the portfolio. Start to get some money now, and not have to wait, another 4 years. It made a lot more sense for Alex to file now than Carrie, because the longer Carrie waits, the more beneficial that's going to be to her benefit amount. Alex has got the smaller amount, so any increases he sees by waiting are going to be smaller in comparison to Carrie. So between the two of them, it's more attractive for Carrie to wait, and she's only 61. And so what we had talked about was, well, why don't we think about starting Alex's income stream now, and then Carrie can start delaying her own benefit. Okay, she doesn't file at 62 or 63 because they've got $5 million in net worth. Because Alex has started his benefit stream, it makes sense for her to wait because they don't absolutely need the income. And so because like I said, there's more of a benefit for her to wait. She should continue to do so for a period of time. What was also comforting to them was, if again, that scenario where Alex, he's older, if he dies in the first couple of years, okay, by filing at 63, and him passing away, Carrie could file potentially for survivor benefit. And again, similar to Emily and Charlie, you would think that, okay, she's just going to collect what Alex was collecting, which was 1840. Okay. But because he filed at age 63, that widow's limit provision came into play again, potentially. If he filed for 1840 a month, he passes away, she was going to get, I think it was closer to like maybe, 2000 or 2100. So she would have gotten a higher amount if he passed away. What would have been nice for her is, as a widow, she would have been able to file for survivor benefits, but to continue to delay her own benefits. And what's interesting is if she starts collecting survivor benefits and she continues to delay her own benefits, she can go beyond 67. So she could even wait until 70 and, get all these increases on her own benefit. So that's what we ended up coming up with at the end of the day. And so a little bit different for Charlie and Emily in that it was a bit of a mixed filing strategy. And the third case, this was with Billy and Kristen. This was, a client I talked to about a year or two ago. They were one of these clients that were very convinced that they should wait until 70. But we reviewed it again once they hit full retirement age. Billy's, currently 68, Kristen's 67. Again, they're both retired. Very high net worth family. They've got around $14 million in assets. Around 10 million of that is in their portfolio. One unique thing about them is, they were very aggressive in putting as much money as they could into qualified accounts, through like 401k, defined benefit plans, IRAs. And that's basically where they stuffed all of their retirement money while they were working, which was great. And they got a lot of growth and a lot of tax deferral by doing that. But now that they're in retirement, even though they've got $10 million, everything that's coming out of the IRAs and the 401ks is taxable at ordinary income rates. And so, they've got a bit of a tax problem because they've got all their money in qualified accounts. They also live a very, very good lifestyle. They've got multiple homes. They're extremely generous with their children, and they like to spend good money on things that are important to them. Like to take really nice trips. They like to take their family on very nice trips. So they have an expensive lifestyle. So, it's very unlikely that they're ever going to spend all of their wealth, but, because of those factors, that they had all their money in qualified accounts, because they, live, a very good lifestyle, they still wanted to review, the best filing strategy for them. So when we talked about it again, Billy's main concern was not about running out of money in retirement, but he was looking at it from a numbers perspective, and he was thinking about, how do I get as much as I can out of Social Security? They were already at full retirement age, so filing early was out of the question. But the main question was, should we file at full retirement age, or should we wait until 70 to file? And that's what we were kicking around. And then for Kristen, she was going to take the spousal benefit. So this will be the first case where that comes into play. Billy's benefit amount was high enough to where after he started collecting, Kristen was going to qualify to take the spousal benefit. But Billy had a question around that of like, okay, does that affect anything? The fact that, she can't file until I file. So it's like neither of them are going to be collecting until Billy made a decision. And so, when you think about filing at 70, that's important because it's like, okay, Kristen can't, collect until Billy collects. And if Billy waits an extra, 2 years, that means that Kristen waits an extra 2 years. And so thought about it, put some thoughts together. And I think in their case, it really made a lot of sense, or at least that you can make a really good argument that they should wait until 70. So I laid out a variety of different factors that I've listed here that I think went into that mindset. And so the first one we mentioned earlier was, these 8% annual increases for anyone that waits after their, every year you wait after your full retirement age. When it comes to Social Security, you get an 8% automatic increase. I think about that from an investment perspective. If you think about, money that you put into your investments, there's very few investments that will say, hey, you can put X amount of dollars into this and we guarantee you're going to get X% return on your money over the next 3 years. And so I think from an investment perspective, that's hard to beat. 8% annual increase guaranteed. The biggest offset to that argument is, well, once you die, that goes away, right? Your investment assets, even though there's no guarantee of how much they're going to increase, that will get passed along to your children. With Social Security, if you wait too long and then you die early, that goes away. But it is an attractive feature from an investment perspective. The second thing is cost of living adjustments, and that's not specific to people that wait until 70. But when you think about if there's a 2% cost of living adjustment, if you have a higher benefit amount that you get at 70, 2% increase on that higher amount at 70 is going to be larger than a 2% increase than the amount that you're getting at 67. So it's not big dollars, but when you think about how that compounds over time, if you start collecting at 70 and you get a cost of living adjustment, on a monthly benefit, that compounds over time. And so for people that file at 70, that spread between, the cost of living adjustment on dollars that you get 67 versus 70, I think is more attractive at 70, and that should be, factored in. Life expectancies, this is the biggest question mark, but you could argue for people that have a very high net worth, in this case, they've got around 14 million in assets, they can probably afford pretty darn good health care. Maybe even they have a concierge doctor, they've just got access and funds to be able to get top quality healthcare. And I think what that indicates is there's a higher percentage chance that they are going to live to 90 plus. And so that's important because if you can get beyond that break even point we talked about earlier, if it's at 82, and you think, it's pretty likely that I might live to 90 because I can afford really good healthcare, that should factor into waiting longer. Survivor benefits. This is an interesting feature as well. We talked about typically when somebody passes away, their widow is able to collect what they were collecting. We talked about the widow's limit provision where you might actually be able to get more if they file early. But when it comes to the typical spousal benefit, you usually get 50% of whatever your spouse's benefit is at age 67. But survivor benefits are different. If someone's collecting a higher amount at 70 and they pass away, you get exactly what they were collecting. And so if you're getting the spousal benefit, you may not get an initial benefit when your spouse files at 70 because the benefit you'll be receiving as a spouse is 50% of their primary insurance amount, which is a lower amount than what they're collecting at 70. But long term, if they pass away first, you will get a benefit from collecting their higher benefit amount that they got at 70. So I think that's important. And then I think the last thing that I mentioned, and again, this is not a big deal breaker, but I don't see this covered a lot in articles, and I think it's important, is taxation. So when you think about, this couple, they've got all their money in qualified, IRA, 401k assets, everything that comes out of there is 100% taxable at ordinary income rates. Social Security benefits, at the most, they're going to be taxed, 85% of the benefit amount is going to be taxed. And so one of the things that we talked about with this couple when we were deciding 67 versus 70, basically the choice was, hey, we could either, start collecting now at 67, get a little bit of a lower amount, but we'll have to take less out of the IRAs and 401ks, or we can tap a little more of the IRAs and the 401ks and then start collecting Social Security at 70. From a tax perspective, it's more tax efficient for them to collect the benefit at 70. I think it can come in two ways, because if they're taking a little more from the IRAs and the 401ks at 67, 68, 69, they may be able to spread out the tax bill from their IRA distributions, over more tax years. They might end up in a lower tax bracket in total in retirement by kind of whittling away at, those IRA and 401k balances. And when they file for Social Security at 70, they get this higher benefit amount, but only 85% of that amount is going to be taxed. And so it's more tax efficient. It's not substantial, it's 15%, but it is something to consider. So for all those different reasons, when we had talked about it, outside of their life expectancy being a huge question mark, we came to the decision that waiting until 70 was going to make the most sense for them. And they were more likely to maximize dollars by rolling the dice that they would live beyond 82. Because of all the features mentioned here, that guaranteed benefit increase of 8%, cost of living adjustment, life expectancies, spousal benefits, and taxation, I think all played into that decision. And so those were those three different case studies that, again, just kind of opened my eyes to, there's a lot of different ways you could go here. And again, I'll be the first to say, and what I advise my clients when we look at Social Security is trust but verify. I always think it's really smart to make an appointment with the Social Security Administration, talk to the experts sitting at the desk there and say, I read about this, or I talked to my advisor about that. They mentioned something about a widow's limit provision. Can you explain that a little more to me? Or, we think this is how, this will work if I pass away at 65, and I want to confirm that the survivor benefit will be this. You definitely want to have that conversation with someone that works for the SSA before you make your filing decision, because it's a really important decision. I think, normally you get the opportunity to maybe change it over the first 12 months of filing. But many times, pretty much always beyond that, it's an irrevocable decision. And so I hope this has been helpful. Again, each of these cases, I'd like to hear about, alternative paths that people might find where they think, there's a better argument to be made about how we approached each of these situations. But, as always, I suggest talking to your advisor, your accountant, talking to Social Security Administration, really looking at your individual circumstances. And I think, if anything, that's hopefully the main takeaway from this today, is that, I do need to take a close look at my individual circumstances, because it's not just a one size fits all. And it's also not a decision where, hey, I don't know when I'm going to die, so there's no point in looking at it. And so, as always, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to our office, and appreciate everybody for joining me on another episode of Building Your Wealth Bridge.